Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This would be session 5. We're gonna make an announcement. Session 4, right?
Yeah, 4.
Okay. So we're gonna be doing some changes because it looks like the course is gonna take a little longer than we had initially expected. So I discussed with Josh and we made some rearrangement for the coming sessions. Once we reach section 5, we're gonna shift the dates to Wednesdays. So which should correspond to the first 2 weeks of the month of April. So we wanna let you know so you can make any necessary arrangements so you can continue attending the class. And we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience because this is the first time we are giving this course. So we could not really predict how long it was gonna take in terms of sessions. So thank you very much for your understanding. And with that, I'm gonna let Josh step in so we can start the session tonight. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Welcome back. So in the last session, we considered the question of why interest exists from a variety of different viewpoints. As I said before, there's no correct answer to this question. People have been thinking about the subject of interest for thousands of years, and we still don't have a definitive answer. So obviously, we're not going to arrive at any indisputable conclusions. So barring that, my goal is to invite each of you to think about the productivity theory, the time preference theory, the fructification theory, etc., and ask yourselves whether they make sense. Are they consistent with your understanding of the laws of nature? Are they consistent with your understanding of human nature? And tonight, we're going to finally arrive at Silvio Gesell's explanation for the existence of interest. And you can then ask yourselves if you find his perspective more or less convincing than the competing theories. So let's reiterate something that we've talked about previously, the fact that nearly all goods and services lose value with the passage of time. It would be great if milk never went bad, metal didn't rust, and termites didn't eat wood, but that's not the universe we live in. Increasing entropy is a law of nature. The laws of nature can't be changed to suit our preferences, so we must adapt ourselves to them. A consequence of the fact that nearly all forms of tangible wealth lose value with the passage of time is that people who earn a livelihood by producing goods and services are under constant pressure to sell their wares sooner rather than later. Generally speaking, the longer they wait, the more they lose. Here's how Gesell describes the situation. Newsboys shout and run because their wares are unsaleable a few hours after production. The milkman's cart is provided with bells because he must make his sales to the hour and minute. The vegetable woman is the earliest riser of God's creatures. She awakens the sleeping cocks. The butcher cannot afford to oversleep himself or to close his shop during the Whitsun holidays, for in 24 hours his wares would be on the verge of putrefaction. Bakers can sell their wares at the regular price only as long as the loaves are warm. The farmer who has plowed out his potatoes and fears an early frost hurriedly collects them and as hurriedly brings them to the market to take advantage of the fine weather and to save as far as possible the laborious loading and unloading of his cheap and heavy product. Or take wage earners, the 10,000 battalions of workmen. Are they not as hurried as the newsboy, the vegetable seller, the farmer? If they do not work, part of their assets, their capability to work, is lost with every beat of the pendulum. Thus, the nature of wares, their transitoriness, arouses the majority of us every morning from sleep, spurs us to haste, and forces us to appear at a given hour in the market. The possessor of wares is commanded by them, under threat of punishment, to seek the market, and the punishment is carried out by the wares themselves. He goes on. The only way in which an owner of wares can protect himself against such losses is to sell them. He is compelled by the nature of his property to offer it for sale. If he resists this compulsion, he is punished, and the punishment is carried out by his property, by the wares in his possession. It must also be remembered that new wares are continually flowing into the market. A cow must be milked daily. A man without possessions is daily compelled by hunger to work. The offer of wares must therefore become larger and more urgent if sale is delayed. As a rule, the most favorable time for the sale of a product is the moment it leaves the factory. The longer sale is delayed, the less favorable the market conditions. The offer of a ware for sale depends, therefore, not upon the will of its possessor, but upon the ware itself. Supply cannot be postponed. Quite independently of the will of the possessor of wares, a supply of them must daily appear in the market. Whether the sun shines or the rain falls, whether political rumors alarm the exchanges, supply is always equal to the stock of wares. Supply remains equal to the stock of wares even if the price of wares are unsatisfactory. Whether the price brings the producer gain or loss, the wares must be offered for sale, usually at once. So let's imagine for a moment a non-monetary economy composed only of goods and services, in which all exchanges are accomplished by barter. In such a system, both sides of every transaction would be subject to pressure to get rid of their products as soon as possible. Of course, everyone wants to obtain the best deal they can get, and they'll negotiate as hard as they can, but everyone also knows that if they fail to make a deal, they will experience loss due to the depreciating nature of their wares. This means that there's a powerful compulsion to transact, and that negotiations take place on a level playing field. Everyone is subject to the same pressure. But what happens when, instead of direct exchange, products are bought and sold using gold money as a medium of exchange? As Gesell notes, gold is one of the very few exceptions to the almost universal law of decay. He writes that gold occupies an exceptional position among the products of the earth. Gold neither rusts nor decays, neither breaks nor dies. Neither frost, heat, sun, rain, nor fire can harm it. The holder of money made of gold need fear no loss arising from the material of its possession. Nor does its quality change. Gold, which has lain buried for 1,000 years, remains unconsumed. The possessor of money can therefore postpone his demand for wares. He can use his will. So when negotiations take place between producers of goods and services on one side and holders of gold money on the other side, the dynamics of the negotiations are fundamentally different than they would be in a non-monetary exchange where goods and services are exchanged for goods and services. Now, on one side of every transaction, there is the pressure caused by the laws of nature, and on the other side, there is immunity from that pressure. If holders of gold money don't like the terms being offered by producers of goods and services, they can break off the negotiations and return home with their gold money, and their money will remain completely intact the next day, the next week, or the next year. But on the other side, producers of goods and services suffer losses with every day that passes without concluding a successful transaction. So the introduction of gold money transforms a level playing field into an unlevel one. And this simple, obvious fact is the central point of the whole Gessellian perspective on money. It is from this fact that Gesell derives his theory of interest, as we'll see shortly. Using gold money as a medium of exchange fundamentally alters the balance of power between buyers and sellers. And why did we make the choice to use gold as our medium of exchange? We did it because we wanted money to also function as a store of value. Gold was not chosen because it's the best medium of exchange. In fact, from a Gessellian point of view, gold is one of the worst possible choices to use as a medium of exchange. Remember Gesell's statement that the power of money to effect exchanges, its technical quality from the mercantile standpoint, is in inverse proportion to its technical quality from the banking standpoint. As we'll see, according to Gesell, the fact that the money material was chosen on the basis of its merits as a store of value, rather than as a medium of exchange, is the root cause of interest. Choosing the substance that we use as money on the basis of its merits as a store of value is the reason why in our society, those who control money are the masters, while those who produce real wealth, goods and services, are at the mercy of those who control money. If the nature and functions of money had been properly understood, if we recognize that the medium of exchange and store of value functions are inherently incompatible, and that the sole legitimate function of money is that of medium of exchange, gold is the last material on earth that we would have chosen as the money material. We would have sought to create an instrument that serves the goods and services it is meant to exchange. But because we misunderstood its appropriate functions, because we included the store of value function, we inadvertently designed an instrument that becomes the master of goods and services. Here's how Gesell describes the interaction between supply in the form of unhoardable goods and services and demand in the form of hoardable money. The possessor of money holds demand like a hound on the leash and lets it slip at the quarry of his choice. Wares are the quarry of demand. Demand enters the market proudly confident of an easy victory. Supply appears dejected, like a beggar who expects more kicks than halfpence. On the one hand, compulsion. On the other hand, freedom. And these two together, compulsion and freedom, determine price. Gesell writes that commerce is mathematically impossible with falling prices. This statement is one of the keys to understanding Gesell's analysis of the problems with money. What does he mean by saying that commerce is mathematically impossible with falling prices? Let's say you've got some gold money and you're planning to make a purchase. Now let's say you learn that the price of the thing you're planning to buy will fall in the near future. What will you do? Obviously, you'll postpone your purchase if possible. Why would you buy something today if you believe you'll be able to buy it next week for less? And since gold money was deliberately designed to function as a store of value, you're under no pressure to get rid of your money. So naturally, you'll wait. On the other side of the supply and demand equation, however, producers of real goods and services don't have the luxury of waiting. Generally speaking, they can't postpone their sale because the physical nature of their wares compels them to get rid of them sooner rather than later. To repeat Gesell's words, as a rule, the most favorable time for the sale of a product is the moment it leaves the factory. Now, I want to interject a personal opinion at this point. I think Gesell's words when he wrote "Commerce is mathematically impossible with falling prices" were poorly chosen. I think he had a critically important point to make, but his statement is too categorical. Obviously, people holding gold money won't refrain from making any purchases at all just because they expect prices to fall. People still need to eat. Holders of money aren't going to starve themselves while waiting for prices to fall. So his statement is not strictly accurate. It's not true that commerce is impossible with falling prices. People will continue to spend on essentials even with falling prices. But what fraction of our purchases are so urgent that we couldn't wait a day, a week, or a month if we believe we can get a better deal by doing so? So I think it would have been better if Gesell had chosen less categorical language in which to make this point, because he was making a very important point, but he made it in such a way that it can be dismissed if one takes an overly literal view of his words. I would have greatly preferred it if he had said commerce is greatly impeded with falling prices. So now let's think about how this unbalanced situation between supply and demand plays out economy-wide. Not only are producers compelled to sell their wares sooner rather than later, but the processes of production, and thus the flow of new goods and services onto the market, cannot be stopped from one day to the next. Let's say a dairy farmer hears that the price of milk is going to fall next week. What can he do about it? Can he stop feeding his cows? Can he stop milking them? What about a physical laborer? If he hears that wages are going to fall, can he decide not to work until the price of labor goes back up? No, most producers of goods and services have little to no ability to postpone their sale due to market conditions. Thus, the flow of wares onto the market, that is, supply, continues regardless of what happens to price. But demand can postpone and withdraw at any time without penalty, and as a result, demand will shrink anytime there are expectations of falling prices. So what happens to the balance between supply and demand if holders of gold money decide to postpone their purchases? Demand shrinks relative to supply. Therefore, prices fall. So expectations of falling prices cause falling prices to become a reality. And when prices do in fact begin to fall, this further increases the incentives for holders of money to postpone their purchases. This creates a self-reinforcing dynamic where falling prices cause prices to fall even more. And at the same time, the unpostponable processes of production of goods and services cause supply to pile up in the marketplace. Let's listen to how Gesell describes the dynamics of a commercial crisis. An actual fall of prices is not necessary to cause the flight of money from the market. If there is a general opinion that prices will fall, no matter whether this opinion is true or false, demand hesitates. Less money is offered. And for this reason, what was expected or feared becomes an actual fact. Is not this sentence a revelation? Does it not give us a clearer explanation of the nature of commercial crises than is contained in any of the many-volumed explanations of the matter? Demand withdraws, conceals itself, because it is insufficient to affect the exchange of wares at the present price level. Supply exceeds demand. Therefore, demand must disappear entirely. A merchant writes an order for cotton. He hears that the production of cotton has increased and consigns the order to his wastepaper basket. Is that not comic? But production continues to throw new masses of wares upon the market. So the stock of wares increases if sales are interrupted, just as the water level of a river rises when the sluices are closed. Supply, therefore, becomes larger and more urgent because demand hesitates. And demand hesitates simply because supply is too large in proportion to demand. Here again, there is no mistake, no misprint. The phenomenon of a commercial crisis, so ridiculous to the onlooker, must have a ridiculous cause. Demand becomes smaller because it is already too small, and supply becomes larger because it is already too large. And let's remind ourselves of something we discussed previously. In a non-monetary economy, such a situation would not arise for two reasons. First, in direct exchange between goods and services, both sides of every transaction are subject to the same compulsion to transact. And second, since in a barter economy, buying and selling are part of the same action, Say's law automatically applies. Buying and selling are always in balance. It's the introduction of money that separates buying and selling into two separate actions and makes it possible for buying and selling to be unbalanced. Money makes it possible to sell without buying, thereby making Say's law inoperative. It's the power differential between producers of unhoardable goods and services and holders of hoardable money that Gesell says is the root cause of interest. The advantage conferred on holders of money due to its hoardability enables them to extract what Gesell refers to as a tribute from producers of unhoardable goods and services. Let's listen to how Gesell describes this dynamic. Suppose now that demand makes use of the freedom it enjoys and withdraws from the market. Supply must then, because of the compulsion to which it is subject, seek out demand, hasten to meet it, and entice it back to the market by the offer of some special advantage. Demand, instant demand, is a necessity to supply, and demand knows of this necessity. Consequently, demand can ask for and obtain some special advantage from its privilege of being able to withdraw from the market. Is there any reason why the possessor of money should not ask for this reward? A and B, separated by space and time, wish to exchange their wares, flour and pig iron, and for this purpose need the money in C's possession. C can at once effect the exchange with his money, or he can delay, hinder, or forbid the exchange, for his money gives him the freedom of choosing the time at which it shall take place. Is it not obvious that C will demand payment for this power, and that A and B must grant it in the form of a tribute on their flour and pig iron? If they refuse this tribute to money, money withdraws from the market. A and B must then retire without completing the sale and undertake the heavy cost of returning home with their unsold products. They will then suffer equally as producers and consumers. As producers, because their wares deteriorate, and as consumers, because they must do without the goods to obtain which they brought their products to the market. If, instead of gold, C owned another product, tea, powder, salt, cattle, the characteristics of these media of exchange would deprive him of the power of postponing his demand. He would no longer be able to levy a tribute on other products. So this is it. This is the point toward which we've been working for the past 3 sessions. We started with the question of why money increases in value with the passage of time when almost all forms of tangible wealth do the opposite. And Gesell's answer is simple yet groundbreaking. He tells us that the power of money to grow has nothing to do with the productivity of capital. It has nothing to do with human nature. It has nothing to do with the productive forces of nature. Rather, it is a consequence of the distortion of the exchange process, which is caused by the fact that instead of recognizing that the sole legitimate function of money is to facilitate the exchange of goods and services, we made the irrational decision to design money so that it will also perform the store of value function. And as a result of this irrational decision, we inadvertently created a medium of exchange that alters the level playing field on which exchange would take place in an economy composed only of goods and services. And interest is a measure of the distortion thereby created. It's a quantification of the amount of power that has been taken away from producers of goods and services and given to holders of money. So in order to illustrate this point, let's think it through in concrete terms. Let's consider 2 different scenarios of economic exchange and show how our existing form of money shifts the balance of power between supply and demand, changing the terms of the resulting exchanges by enabling holders of money to extract tribute from producers of goods and services. Let's start with the simplest exchange we can imagine. Person A produces eggs and person B produces beef, and they want to negotiate an exchange. Obviously, person A wants to give as few eggs for as much beef as possible, and person B wants the exact opposite. So how do they decide upon a ratio of exchange? That is to say, a price. Is there a price list produced by the government? No, not in a free market there isn't. Rather, both parties use every tool at their disposal to get the best deal possible. The egg seller tells the beef producer that he doesn't even like beef very much and that he could just walk across the street and buy chicken instead. The beef producer tells the egg seller that just yesterday a different egg seller offered a better deal. They might even insult each other's mothers in the process. But they both know that if they fail to reach an agreement, they'll both lose. Each will have to return home still in possession of their own wares, which lose value by the hour or the day. Thus, there is pressure on both sides of the negotiation, making it much more likely that the parties will ultimately reach an agreement, even after insulting each other's mothers, and make an exchange rather than walking away from the negotiation. So let's say that after much argument and haggling, the two agree to exchange a dozen eggs for a pound of beef. In other words, through the process of negotiation between free individuals on a level playing field, with neither party bound by any restrictions other than their own self-interest and the laws of nature, two people with completely opposite agendas arrived at an agreement. They agreed that a dozen eggs is worth a pound of beef. In other words, they established a price. Now let's replay the scenario, changing one single aspect of the situation. Let's exempt person B's beef from the laws of nature. Let's say that his beef will never go bad. How will this change the terms of the exchange? Both men are still free. There's still no law or centrally imposed price list telling them how many eggs should be given in exchange for a pound of beef. They'll both still use the same arguments as before to try to negotiate the best deal possible. But person B now knows that if he fails to reach an agreement, he can go home with his beef and he will suffer no loss. and he also knows that person A doesn't have the same luxury. How will this affect the outcome of the negotiations? It's simple common sense that they will not arrive at the same price as before, isn't it? Because the previously level playing field has been altered in a very important way. Person B now has power in the negotiation that he didn't previously have, and this power will change the result of the negotiations. It will change the price that the two parties ultimately agree to. Let's say that now, instead of getting a dozen eggs for a pound of beef, due to his increased power, person B is now able to get 14 eggs for a pound of beef. This difference is what Gesell referred to as a tribute. In this case, the tribute is 2 eggs. And by choosing to use gold money as our medium of exchange, this is precisely the dynamic we've created when producers of unhoardable goods and services negotiate with holders of hoardable money. We've transformed a level playing field upon which barter transactions would take place, and instead created an unlevel playing field, which favors holders of money over producers of goods and services. Silvio Gesell tells us that this power differential, this ability to extract tribute, is the cause of interest. But remember, both the classical school and the Marxists basically ignored money. For them, exchanging apples for lumber was not qualitatively different than exchanging apples for gold money and then gold money for lumber. They viewed both as just different instances of the exchange of commodities. So is it any wonder that neither of them were able to make sense of the phenomenon of interest? As Gesell writes, Orthodox and Marxian economists are agreed that interest is an inseparable concomitant of private ownership of the means of production. Those who reject communism, community of property, and desire liberty in economic life must accept an economic system founded upon interest, that is, capitalism. So say all who have hitherto investigated the problem of interest. The investigators differ indeed widely in their moral judgment of interest, but that is a matter of secondary importance, which does not help to clarify the problem. Whether interest, as the socialists aver, is the result of forcible appropriation, of an immoral abuse of economic power, or whether, on the contrary, the orthodox economists are right in ascribing it to the economic virtues of order, industry, and thrift, is of little importance to the dispossessed workers, to the proletariat which has to bear the burden of interest. Gesell's great insight is that money is not a commodity. Money is a tool created by society in order to unlock the enormous wealth-creating power of the division of labor system. So exchanging money for goods and services is not like any other exchange of commodities. And because we chose a form of money that is not subject to the same laws of nature and the same compulsion to circulate as the goods and services it is used to exchange, we have created a situation in which the blood of the economic organism extracts tribute whenever it facilitates exchange. So we need to investigate this concept of tribute more closely. Gesell writes, the present form of money acts as intermediary for the exchange of wares only on condition that it receives a tribute. If the market is a road for the exchange of wares, money is a toll gate built across the road and opened only upon payment of the toll. The toll, profit, tribute, interest, or whatever we choose to call it, is the condition upon which wares are exchanged. No tribute, no exchange. I wish to avoid all possibility of misunderstanding. I am not now speaking of commercial profit, of the payment which the merchant can and does demand for his work. What I speak of here is the profit which the possessor of money can demand from producers because he can paralyze the exchange of wares by withholding his money. This profit has nothing in common with the merchant's profit. It is a separate effect produced by money itself, a tribute which money is able to exact because, unlike all other wares, it is free from the material compulsion of being offered for sale. Wares must pay money a tribute because money is free. There's no other possibility. Without this tribute, money will not be offered in exchange. And without money to effect exchanges, no wares will reach their destination. If, for any reason, money cannot exact its accustomed tribute, there's a crisis. Wares lie where they are and rot. According to Gesell, money should have been designed to make economic exchange as automatic, frictionless, and efficient as possible. But because we misunderstood its appropriate functions, we designed a form of money that inhibits exchange and extracts value from it. If we return to the metaphor of money as the blood of the economic organism, we designed a form of blood that does not flow of its own accord. As Gesell says, the offer of goods and services for sale is not dependent on the will of their producers. They have to be offered for sale no matter what, and their physical nature punishes anyone who does not do so. But the nature of money does not compel it to circulate. As a result, a drug must be administered to force the blood to circulate. That drug is interest. So let's think about how this power differential, this ability to extract tribute, translates into interest. Let's imagine a scenario of saving and investment in a non-monetary economy. Let's say there's a cattle rancher who, because of his skill and hard work, produces more beef than he needs to exchange for all of the goods and services that he and his family consume. Since he consumes less than he produces, he has savings. And let's say that he wants to save up to buy a car. The problem, though, is that his savings are in a form that will lose all of its value in a matter of days if he holds on to them. So how can he accumulate enough savings to buy a car? Let's say he connects with another member of the community who has a business producing dog food, and beef is an input to his production process. So the two individuals decide to negotiate a deal for the beef producer to provide weekly deliveries of his excess beef in exchange for a lump sum payment in the future at a time when the accumulated savings will have amounted to enough to buy a car. Both parties will benefit from this arrangement, but remember, there's no rule book or central authority to determine how much beef the rancher needs to give the dog food manufacturer or how large the future lump sum payment must be. The two parties have exactly opposite agendas in this regard. But the rancher knows that if he fails to reach an agreement, he'll be stuck with his rapidly deteriorating savings. So let's say they settle on terms whereby the rancher provides X pounds of beef per week and the manufacturer pays a lump sum of Y at a specified date in the future. Now let's change the scenario and add gold money into the equation. Now, instead of directly providing the beef, the rancher sells his excess beef for money. He now has his savings in the form of money rather than beef. And instead of receiving beef directly from the rancher, the manufacturer now needs money to buy beef with which to make dog food. So he asks the rancher for a loan of money with which to buy the beef. Now let's remind ourselves that nothing has changed in terms of the productive activities of the two individuals. The rancher still produces the rancher still produces an excess of beef, which the manufacturer needs as an input to his production process. But is it not obvious that these negotiations will go very differently than in the first scenario? Due to the fact that the rancher is no longer under pressure from the depreciating nature of his savings, he'll be able to drive a harder bargain. And when they reach an agreement, either X, the money equivalent of pounds of beef the rancher provides to the manufacturer, will be smaller, or Y, the lump sum payment, will be larger, or both. This means that the rancher's overall rate of return on the arrangement will be greater than in the first scenario. The difference in the rate of return is interest. And this example illustrates that the cause of that interest has nothing whatsoever to do with the productive activities of the two individuals. The reason why the rancher is able to extract an additional return is not due to the productivity of his beef. It is due to the power of his money. So to conclude today's session, I want to circle back and wrap up our discussion of the theories of interest. As I mentioned last time, I postponed discussion of the Keynesian theory until after we looked at Gesell's theory, because Keynes's theory came after Gesell, and in my opinion, it is built on the foundation of Gesell's ideas. Keynes claims to have arrived at his theory independently of Gesell. In the general theory, he writes of Gesell's analysis. Owing to certain palpable defects in the argument, I entirely failed to discover their merit. As is often the case with imperfectly analyzed intuitions, their significance only became apparent after I had reached my own conclusions in my own way. We'll examine these so-called defects in a future class, but the fact that Keynes felt compelled to state that he arrived at his conclusions in his own way is, in my mind, implicit acknowledgement of the fact that he recognized that important elements of his own theory had already been advanced by Gesell. As you recall, our friend Carlos Luge from Argentina wrote a book in which he argues that Gesell deserves credit for laying the foundations of the Keynesian perspective on macroeconomics. I mentioned previously that many people incorrectly refer to Gesell as a Keynesian. This is obviously inaccurate due to the chronology of the two men's lives. However, it absolutely would be accurate to describe Keynes as a Gessellian, although I would argue that he was not a very good Gessellian. As I said, we'll go into that in detail in a future class. So how does Keynes explain the existence of interest? Keynes based his theory on a concept he called liquidity preference. According to him, interest is not caused by the productivity of real capital. It is not caused by preference for present consumption over future consumption, and it is not caused by the productive forces of nature. Rather, in Keynes's view, interest is a consequence of a preference on the part of savers to hold their wealth in the form of money rather than other, less liquid assets. In other words, people with savings view money as a superior vehicle for the storage of wealth than other options like stocks, bonds, commodities, etc. And therefore, they must be offered a reward to get them to hold their wealth in other forms and return money to circulation. In other words, for Keynes, interest is a non-hoarding premium that must be paid to savers to get them to relinquish the advantages of money as a store of value. According to this theory, the rate of interest is a measure of how strong this preference is. Keynes attributes the preference for holding money to a variety of different factors. Among these is the advantage money enjoys over tangible assets due to the physical processes of decay. This, of course, is the primary factor to which Silvio Gesell attributes the existence of interest. But Keynes developed a more complex, multifaceted perspective on the advantages of money compared to other categories of assets. For example, he incorporates the element of uncertainty, something that Gesell didn't include in his analysis. In this sense, Keynes's theory can be thought of as an advance from Gesell's theory. Keynes recognized that shielding holders of money from the physical forces of decay is not the only advantage money provides its holders in comparison with other assets. Money also protects its holders from uncertainty, which, Keynes argues, increases the preference to hold wealth in the form of money, and thereby increases the reward that must be offered to induce holders of money to convert their wealth into other forms and return their money to circulation. Without going too deep into the weeds of the liquidity preference theory, let's just consider one concrete example to illustrate the point. Let's say you're saving up to buy a car that costs $20,000. You could choose to hold your savings in the form of money, or you could hold it in stocks, bonds, commodities, etc. But any option other than money involves greater uncertainty than money. Since money is the generally accepted legal tender form of payment, you know with a high degree of confidence how much wealth you're going to have to give to acquire the car, if you hold that wealth in the form of money. But what if you instead decide to hold your savings in shares of Apple stock? Now you're subject to the uncertainty of what price Apple will be at the point of time in the future when you're ready to buy the car. What if Apple announces disappointing iPhone sales a week before you're ready to buy your car? Whereas money, as the most liquid form of wealth, presents the least uncertainty in terms of future purchasing power. And from a Keynesian perspective, this reduction in uncertainty has economic value. And therefore, holders of money must be compensated in order to get them to forego this advantage and return their money to circulation. So the important point to note is that both Gesell and Keynes view interest as arising from money's superiority to other categories of assets as vehicles for storing wealth. In other words, they both view interest as a consequence of our decision to design money so that it can be used to perform the store of value function. Obviously, this is a completely different view of interest from any of the competing theories. They both view interest as a reward that must be paid to savers to get them to relinquish the advantages of money as a store of value. Keynes deserves credit for refining and advancing the analysis of why money is able to extract this reward, but Gesell was the one who pioneered the view of interest as a non-hoarding premium. We'll go into the consequences of this perspective in greater depth in the next class. Viewing interest as a non-hoarding premium has huge implications in terms of how we understand the role of money and interest in the overall economy. An insightful German commentator from the 1950s, Otto Valentin, discussed this point. He wrote, "The owner of capital, supported by the superiority of conventional money over other goods, is able to hoard money with impunity and enjoy the convenience of liquidity. Since money is indispensable for the modern economy, the money owner can obtain a price in the form of interest for his temporary renunciation of liquidity." He goes on to point out that money with such characteristics will understandably only be invested if it promises at least an interest rate equal to monetary interest. If there is no prospect of a corresponding interest rate, then the investment is omitted. The money isn't converted into real capital. This means that monetary interest is primary and material interest is secondary. This is exactly the opposite of what has been assumed by classical theory since Ricardo. Valentin continues, Keynes expresses the same thought with the following words. It seems then that the interest rate on money plays a peculiar role in limiting the level of employment, since it sets a standard which the marginal efficiency of capital must reach if it is to be newly produced. Thus, Valentin says the riddle of interest on capital, which had caused so much ink to be used over the decades, the answer to the fundamental and as yet unanswered question, whence and why the capitalist receives interest, had finally been solved. Gesell discovered that interest is a purely monetary matter, based on the treasury character of money. The dynamic whereby the money rate of interest limits the production of real capital turns out to be an enormously important point that we'll investigate in the next class. As a final thought for today, I want to recall something I said in the first class. I made the statement that money is not wealth. One reason I gave for not considering money to be wealth is because it's not the product of human labor. I therefore argued that treating money as a form of private wealth is harmful to society, and that a proper understanding of money would recognize it as a creation of society, a public utility designed to help everyone reap the enormous rewards of the division of labor. In this sense, money can be thought of as being like public roads. Public roads are not forms of private property or wealth. They're public utilities created by society to improve the living standards of all its members. The charging of interest is like allowing people to park their cars on public roads and then charging to move their cars so traffic can flow. Permitting the extraction of interest is allowing private parties to treat a public resource as a form of private property and charge for its use. Obviously, we wouldn't tolerate such a situation on our roads, but we do tolerate an analogous situation when it comes to the vital public resource of money. So now that we've covered the subject of why interest exists, in the next class, we'll look at the consequences of interest. We'll see how interest affects wages, the availability of capital, how it influences the distribution of wealth, how it causes economic instability, and how it's the driving force behind the so-called growth imperative. And then finally, we'll look at Silvio Gesell's proposal for a different form of money that would reduce or eliminate interest and thereby alleviate or solve all of the problems arising from interest. So we can now open the floor for questions and comments.
Thanks a lot, Josh. That was a fantastic lecture. Comments or questions? I see Dr. Perry.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you, Josh. I'm afraid that money, as you're describing it, is actually a straw man. The money that you describe has never actually existed, because the money that you describe does not take account of the synthesis with time which produces the money. That is, money, as you're describing it, is not the product of a synthesis which involves time. What is the product of a synthesis with a store of value, if you will, that involves time is credit. And the time imperative on credit is just as great as the time imperative on commodity goods.
Okay, I believe you're the same person who said after the first class that we essentially already have Gesellian money because of inflation. Am I correct about that?
Well, that's not quite what I said. I said that what he is trying to achieve with money is in fact already achieved with credit in the modern economy. And getting mired in questions of what is money is, well, it's so 19th century. Although Keynes, of course, suffered from it. Gesell suffers from it. Henry George did not suffer from it, but that's because he begins at a totally different place. He begins with the verbs of production and the root of the land as the fuel to the verbs of production. That is, he never gets himself mired in nouns as products. I won't go into the ontological versus etiological framework here, but it's conclusively provable that money as you describe it never exists in the real world, because money as you describe it does not take account of time, which is inexorable in the real world. As you quite rightly say, we have this single direction of time, which seems to be the only single directional thing in the cosmos.
Okay, a couple of things. First, anyone who uses the words conclusively provable when it comes to questions of economics understands economics very differently than I do. I don't think anything in economics is conclusively provable. Economics is as complex as the 8+ billion individuals who make up the economic organism, all of whom are different. So I don't think anything is conclusively provable. What I said in response to your...
In economics and genomics as the only two subjects for the methodology I'm describing, because economics and genomics are essentially identical in their constitution and in their functioning. And the ability conclusively to prove how a genomic transaction proceeds from input nouns through a series of transformational processes to output nouns demonstrates how economic processes operate in precisely the same way.
Okay, I didn't really follow that. But to return to the main point here, which is whether our existing form of credit money enjoys an imbalance of power vis-a-vis goods and services, I still maintain that the Gesellian position is correct. And as I said in response to your question after the first class, I wrote an article specifically about this. I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at it, but we're going to review its contents in the next class, because like I referred to in this class, the key statement is that commerce is mathematically impossible with falling prices. If you really understand the ramifications of that idea, then I think you'll see that credit money does in fact enjoy a power differential over goods and services when prices are falling. Not at all times, not even at most times, because generally speaking, credit money leads to inflation. Purchasing power erodes over long periods of time. But what matters to producers of goods and services is not what's happening over long periods of time. What matters is what's happening today, this week, this month. And if prices are falling, then credit money enjoys a power differential over goods and services, and that plays out in the same way that we talked about today with the extraction of tribute.
All right, we'll go with Joe Polito.
Thanks so much, Josh. Another very interesting, thought-provoking lecture. I do have some reactions, but I'm just gonna suspend them until you've completed the series, because I think that's the only way to keep my mind open about all the possibilities of your assessments. It's interesting that Mr. Perry, or Dr. Perry, was the first person to question you, because I find you both have something very much in common. Reminds me of Plato, who said people can't enter his philosophy academy until they master geometry. And you both have a very geometric way of communicating. I just have a sense of this, theorem, axiom, proof kind of thinking that you both display. Is very impressive. I do have a question, though, about investment. Seems to me you have to have a society where you have a surplus so that you can invest some of the surplus resources into the capacity to produce capital and efficiencies, which lead to productivity improvements. And I just wondered what Gesell's views on that were. Some of the things you said today kind of spurred that question. Thank you.
Sure. I tried to address what you just asked about in the analogy of the stream and the ponds. Toward the end of that class, I spoke about two different pond building projects. One in which someone just digs a hole and diverts the flow of the stream to fill his pond. And I described that as being potentially harmful to society if it's done under the wrong conditions. And then the second example was one in which someone with excess resources, savings, puts those excess resources at the disposal of someone else who is either not employed or not fully employed, and has a desire but not the and skills but not the capital to engage in economic production. And in that instance of pond building, the pond can be beneficial both to the individual who builds the pond and also to the community. And the difference is the flow. In the second example, water is flowing into and also out of the pond. In the first example, it's only flowing in and staying there. So So the point as it relates to investment versus savings is that savings is not flow. Savings is not even an action. Savings is just the absence of consumption. Investment is flow. Investment is taking resources and deploying them. It's spending money on salaries, on supplies, on equipment, on services. And all of those are forms of flow. So the critical consideration from a Gessellian perspective, and for this purpose, I think the analogy of a public road is a good one, is that flow, constant, continuous, frictionless flow is the determinant of health. A road is never healthy when it's jammed up, and neither is money.
But I appreciate that. I'm just like, economics, the classic definition of economics is that it's the science of learning how to use our scarce resources in the most efficient way. And if a person, as you've described, is an extraordinarily good at producing a giant surplus in agriculture or beef production, they're building this huge surplus, which they can exchange for hard goods, lasting goods. I mean, they can build castles, they can build bigger castles, they can buy more land. I mean, it can accumulate things which really don't relate to production. Whereas if you can induce the person to share their surplus with the individual you described, those surplus resources can be used to raise our standard of living, can use to increase productivity. And I just wondered how Gesell, since interest is not desirable, how is he going to induce people to
Save.
to donate those resources to those productivity activities, and because it's not really in their interest, they have everything they need, and they can build a greater and greater, consumptive life, and like, how is he going to induce that? I guess that's my question.
Because every other form in which they can hold that wealth, except land, of course, is the key exception to this statement. Pretty much every other form in which they can hold that wealth is going to lose value with the passage of time. They can build a castle. Have you ever had a castle? A castle costs a fortune to maintain. A house costs a fortune to maintain. Gold is one of the very few exceptions to this rule, but 99% of tangible wealth loses value with the passage of time. So what's the alternative? Invest in capital. Capital in an ideal Gessellian economy with a rate of interest that has fallen to zero is a pure store of value. Capital would generate exactly as much revenue as is needed to maintain it, and nothing further. It is the artificial scarcity of capital in our existing system that's the source of the excess returns that everyone has come to expect as normal and natural from capital. But I would say that that is symptomatic of a pathological thought process, that the idea that we are supposed to be able to hold our wealth in a form that maintains its value is completely contrary to the laws of nature. What form of tangible wealth can you put your excess savings into that is not going to lose value with the passage of time? So capital with no excess return, but as a process which continually renews and maintains itself, is the most effective store of value in a non-interest economy, even if it does not produce growth.
Thank you. There are other hands up, and I'll just leave you with a thought. In when there's royalty and economic royalty, they tend to just accumulate, castle upon castle, artifact upon artifact, painting upon painting, statue upon statue, and there doesn't seem to be that trend toward productivity in the Middle Ages and so forth. But anyways, thanks so much, and we'll move on to the next question. Take care.
Samuel.
Hello. Thanks for the talk and the lesson. You mentioned during your examples products like eggs and beef, both very perishable. What about what would the dynamics be if instead of beef it was a trade between eggs and let's say some kind of machinery or something that had a longer life? Would that also have the same dynamic of the person trading the thing with the longer shelf life having some sort of advantage in that trade negotiation process because of that shelf life? And if that is the case, is there something inherently wrong with that situation that we should be trying to also look at?
Okay, it's a very good question. I would say anything which is natural is not wrong. And it is obviously a fact that different forms of tangible wealth, different substances, deteriorate at very different rates. An unrefrigerated piece of meat loses all of its value in a couple of days. Metal and wood, lose their value much more slowly. However, I would say that the mechanism for equalizing those differences is the market. I'm not going to choose to be a cattle rancher, a producer of meat, versus a producer of machinery, unless the returns are there to justify it. So you're right that all else equal, a person in possession of a steak is at a disadvantage to a person in possession of a piece of machinery. But the question is how much resources throughout the economy get directed to producing steaks and to producing machinery. But all of them, with a few minor exceptions. Gold, I consider to be a minor exception because gold, whose life would be significantly worse if they never had access to gold? Gold is such an incidental part of the overall economic system that, yeah, it's an interesting and important exception, but it does not in any way negate the fact that 99% of all material wealth loses value with the passage of time. And even a piece of machinery, a computer, a car, obsolescence is a very important cause of declining value with the passage of time. It doesn't only happen because something physically breaks down. There's a lot of different causes for the loss of economic value with the passage of time. So I'm not sure if I answered your question or not.
Yeah, you mentioned gold, and that's a good example. Like you're saying it's okay as long as things are natural. Well, gold is natural, and that's why for the longest time gold was used as money, right? Well, as a medium of exchange, even if you are saying that it's terrible as a medium of exchange, it's been used as such for quite a long time. And it does not deteriorate as you say. So is that a Is that a good use of gold? You know, because it is natural, it is able to be traded, and the shelf life is infinitely long.
Is that a good use? I would say use as a medium of exchange is not a good use. That's the whole point of the Gesellian perspective. Use as a store of value is fine. I have no problem, and Gesell had no problem with people who choose to use gold as a store of value, as long as it's not at the same time the generally accepted legal tender medium of exchange. And this relates to what we will talk about when we get to really digging into the comparison between Keynes and Gesell, because this was the issue that Keynes zeroed in on and considered a defect in Gesell's analysis. Personally, I think Keynes was wrong about that, but we will look at that specifically in either the next class or the following one.
Okay, thank you.
Nick.
Yeah, just hey Josh, thanks for everything. Just a couple of comments. I was trying to formulate a question, but I think it's best maybe just to give a couple of brief comments and then you can respond. The gentleman earlier who was mentioning about credit, and that's kind of a Gesellian money that we may have. I thought that was interesting, because I'm a Gesellian, or at least I feel like I am. I'm still learning a lot, but I do believe that there's some value to his theories. What I found interesting, in my opinion, it seems like maybe the credit that we have as money has, maybe there were some powerful people at one point who realized Gesell was onto something. And I feel like it's maybe a shadow Gesellian economy that we live in. In other words, when you're speaking about credit, you also have to consider the collateral. Credit doesn't just come out of nowhere. I mean, we like to think it does, but it seems like it's based on some type of collateral, whether that's goods or services or some kind of contract. And that's one comment. And the second comment was, it may have been the same gentleman. I was just reading the chat because I was going to bring up the word seigniorage. And what we have in the world economies now is this idea of seigniorage and the profit that governments retain for the use of money. And one of the issues that I want to learn about Gesell is the fact that, you know, the feeling around the world, especially in this country, and I'm in the US, we don't hold the value that the money is supposedly containing. That money belongs to another power or another bank, more specifically the Federal Reserve Bank. So the value that's contained, so to speak, in the money is not held by the people who possess the money. Rather, it's held by the holders of the secured debt instruments that the money is based on, which comes from the theory of credit. I mean, it's the Social Security credit of the Treasury. And I think I'll leave it at that. Maybe if you want to respond to those.
Yeah, sure. So I think you're absolutely right that our existing system is insane and unjust, because the government has essentially subcontracted out the function of monetary creation to the private banking industry. And that is, it's an enormously profitable and powerful function that the government should, in my opinion, be using on behalf of the society as a whole. And instead, they have handed it off to private banks. So So interesting to note, both Gesell and Henry George envisioned models of public revenue that involve no taxation. Well, I mean, other than the land tax in the case of Henry George. But what the point is that if government was to lay claim to its legitimate function as the steward of the commons, then that comes along with an enormous amount of revenue generating capability, whether it is in the form of a land tax or in the form of leasing land, and also on the side of money, seigniorage and the revenue created through the process of money creation. Both of those represent, I would say, natural and just forms of public revenue. And imagine a world where you paid no income tax, where you paid no sales tax, where you paid no corporate tax, where you paid no gas tax, but and that the government funded itself from these two other sources, which are elements of the commons, money and land.
Dr. Mahdi?
Yeah, well, thanks, Josh. Interesting that you were talking about the commons and public revenue right before me asking my question, because my question has to do with just give a background. I work for the New York City Parks Department, and I'm an expert on infrastructure management, writing standards for professional organizations. But you mentioned a public road, and that kind of stuck out prominently for me, because up until that point you were talking about factories producing this and people holding back this and that. But when we start talking about a public road, that necessarily means that we're going outside of the private economy and into the goods and services that are kind of like the bread and butter of cities and towns and such. So one of the things that's interesting about those government goods and services is that it providing exactly what you're talking about, a public road, I guess theoretically allows money to flow, but it also allows people to flow and other kind of things, so that transactions and the economy kind of like are more robust, let's say. So I guess my question has to do with, as we go further into this, are you going to differentiate or maybe include a more thorough treatment of public economy as opposed to the private, or does that get off into the weeds as regarding Gesell?
I'm not sure what that would exactly consist of, distinguishing between public and private economy. I certainly will get into that question specifically in relation to land, because we have yet to even touch on the Gesellian analysis of the land problem and his proposal, which, as we know, is different from that of Henry George. And that's going to be an interesting discussion with you all, comparing and contrasting the two approaches and looking at the pros and cons. But I don't know, maybe I'll throw the question back at you. What would be an example of of a concrete issue that you would want to see addressed in that way?
Well, I guess take, for example, public safety, security. When New York City has a problem with security, it means that people are going to be hesitant to go into the street, transact and such, so that people who show up for work as policemen, they're not holding back or doing whatever you're talking about as far as an economic process. They show up because they get paid well. So public economy is all about the flow of money because they do get paid and they go out and they buy stuff. So the public economy, in my opinion, is such a big factor within the overall economy as we speak. And I think it's important to note when we start talking about the public economy, like you did when you talked about a public road, the way that you brought it up, and you didn't really have to, and I didn't expect you to go into any depth about the public road, but I think it's good to point out that you're going off of the private economy discussion into, public road. Well, where'd that come from? Did it fall out of the sky? Well, there's a definite process of that road being produced and maintained and such. So I would say, there's 15 types of tangible and intangible services that governments provide, and when they're providing them well, that means that like the city of New York is a place people want to come to. So it's creating wealth. So I just think it's important to just make a note that at some point when you talk about, let's say, a public road, that we're veering off of a pure discussion about the private economy.
Yeah, well, I mean, the purpose of talking about a public road was to make an analogy, not to talk specifically about the economics of public utilities. All I'll say is that while I certainly agree with the importance that you are putting on public goods, Gesell doesn't have much to say about them. Gesell, I view Gesell as being perhaps the purest exponent of the free market system ever in human history. I think. I mean, he was attempting to conceive of a pure implementation of free market principles. So I don't think Gesell would have, he didn't talk about it as far as I know, but I don't think that he would have been a big supporter of large scale investment in like culture, arts. My sense is that he would have considered those as belonging in the private sector. I think that his guiding principle would be that what can be left to the private sector should be left to the private sector.
Yeah, I guess that's where I think Henry George veers off, because I think he does consider those public services to be part of the, well, I guess he would call it the political economy or the body economic. But anyway, appreciate the answer.
Thanks. Alan Smith, right?
Yeah, it's just unmuted myself. Yeah, I just wanted to respond somewhat to both Marty and Nick, who and Dr. Perry been saying that maybe we already have a kind of gazillion as an economy with the.
Until you said it to afford a basic living. Bro, I'm not doing that shit. What you gonna do? Just not have a job? Hell yeah.
Alan, do you have
I'm
some?
not sure what happened. I'm hearing another voice.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me take care of that. Go ahead, Alan. Looks good.
Okay. So it's true that we have a credit money which depreciates over time. We have a constant, attrition to, price inflation, i.e. monetary inflation, and the decreasing value of the dollar, whatever we call it, bank credit. I wanted to point out to Nick, however, that's only, as Marty says, that's only part of the money supply. A heck of a lot of it is coming from government spending and government authorized subsidies and the Defense Department. And then we have the fact that the allocation of credit is being made by private parties, banks and borrowers, and then by the corporate lobbied, captured government. So it's not distributed or allocated in any kind of way that has really much of a public purpose. Would you agree with my thoughts there? Also, that collateral, again, the government issued stuff isn't done with collateral. I don't think it's really it's just special interest money. It goes to defense spending and so on. Your thoughts? And thanks to Josh for all this.
Who was that question directed
To
to?
you. Well, to you. Just for comment.
It's more of a question, right, Alan?
What was the question?
It's more of a comment than a question.
It's more of a comment.
Okay, good. So let's move to Joris. You need to unmute. Okay.
Hi, yes. Thanks, Josh, for the lecture. Yeah, I'm digesting all that you said and also things other people said. I'm more attuned to the Gesellian vision, so that's easier for me. I heard some comments about credit money versus money, and I'm wondering what is really the difference. The way I view it, I think the essence of what money is, as a medium of exchange at least, is the administration of credit. Without, well, money comes into existence as credit, and you can say it is backed by something, all right, but in essence it's credit, and the value of well, let me start with just asking you that. Is that the way you think as well, that the essence of a medium of exchange is the administration of credit?
If by that you mean that whoever comes into possession of money is owed something in exchange for it, then I suppose that it is by its nature credit. But an important difference is that the magnitude of what is owed is not specified. And that's for the free market to work out. So I'm not sure if it's a semantic difference or a substantive difference. Did that answer your question to your satisfaction?
I'll think about it more, but I think we're on the same page. Cool. I also wanted to say you told about the reason for there being interest, and what interest is. And I think you said that Gesell, as well as others, defined it as a non-hoarding premium, for money. And I noticed that that is exactly the type of thinking that ended the ban on usury in the Middle Ages. It was Francis Bacon in the 16th century who said, I'll quote him, "Since there must be borrowing and lending, and men are so hard of heart as they will not lend freely, usury must be permitted." And it was after a lot of people went into debt, which they could not repay, and they had to take out loans in the Renaissance, loans that they could not repay, that the church instituted the Mount of Piety, which was relatively low interest loans to poor people. And then from there on, things proceeded with more and more things being allowed. Yet I do not completely agree with this. I think, well, of course, just it is a non-hoarding premium in a sense, but we don't need a non-hoarding premium in order to provide credit. Because most credit is bookkeeping nowadays, of course. And even before that, you had the goldsmiths who gave out paper receipts for money supposedly being in their vaults. The fractional reserve type of creating money. So credit is mostly not people's savings that are being lent out. So I think it's sort of it can be misconstrued as a justification for interest. So I wanted to make that comment. Yeah, and I'll yield the floor.
Yeah, so that was kind of a wide-ranging comment. I would say that, I think it was 2 classes ago, we talked about the quantity theory of money and the notion that the price level is a function of the amount of money in circulation and the velocity of that circulation. And conventional thinking tends to operate on the quantity side of that equation. And my point and Gesell's point is that that's the wrong side to be adjusting, that the problem is the incredibly unstable nature of the velocity side of the equation. And the point of the Gessellian monetary proposal of demurrage is to stabilize velocity so that small
I understand that is very much important, the velocity of money and it works against hoarding, but isn't credit also essential? I mean, people come into this world owning nothing, but they have the ability to work. So should they save up and be on a leash of the people already having money, or should they be helped to create a business and provide people their products that can be in the general interest? So I think there's something to say for credit being an essential service.
Well, I would say that I believe that Gesell's response to that would be that a neutral form of money would completely shift the balance of power between those who provide credit and those who avail themselves of credit.
That provide services and work. Yeah.
So, you know, we are the idea of interest and the power relations inherent in interest are so deeply ingrained in our consciousness that for us, when one goes and asks for a loan, one is in a subservient position. One is going on bended knee and asking for the blessing of the person who is providing the resources that we need.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that that is not a natural situation. That is a distorted situation caused by the non-neutrality of money, and that a natural situation would be one like the Robinson Crusoe story, in which it's clear that the borrower is doing every bit as valuable a service to the lender as the lender is doing for the borrower.
Okay.
All right, we have Ed Dodson and Yanis. It's about time, so if you can make it brief.
I'm going to make this quick, Josh. I'm wondering about Gesell's views on the distinction between making a loan to someone and extending them credit. By that, I mean, if I'm a businessman and I have customers who are buying my merchandise, I am likely to say to them, you can take the merchandise and you have X number of days to make a payment to me for them. If you make that payment within 10 days, you'll get a discount of X. Within 30 days, a discount of nothing. And within 60 days, a penalty of X, which implies two things: the time value of money, the fact that the absence of payment means that the provider of the goods is in diminished capacity for meeting other expenses. But it also gives the customer the opportunity to actually resell the goods to a third party in order to raise the cash in order to make the payment. So does he distinguish between those two situations, making of a loan and the extending of credit?
Yes. In his section on the theory of interest, he talks extensively about bills of exchange, which are essentially what you're talking about, the extension of credit. And his, it's a very complex analysis, but to sum it up quickly, he says that there are three alternatives to the use of money in terms of what can motivate economic production. One is primitive, self-sufficient production. Two is barter. And three is bills of exchange, which is the extension of credit in place of money. So yes, that distinction is a critically important piece of his overall perspective on interest.
Very good, thank you.
All right, Yanis.
Yes, first of all, I want to thank you, Josh, for a great presentation, but I also want to thank everybody for having very substantial, substantive, and productive conversations, and we have to try to disambiguate and try to converge the nomenclature, the definitions that each of us is using, and this is extremely productive, and I would welcome everyone, regardless if sometimes it gets there is friction, to welcome it as productive. Now, I will be very brief. you said something which, of course, is very big word, that Gesell is the first one to theorize, the proper way to have like a free market economy or something like that. And of course, in anticipation of your comparative juxtaposition between Gesell and George, I want to preempt by saying that if Gesell does not have a theory of rent and how rent itself is the only monkey wrench that can destroy a free market economy, then I would ask you to take that big maxim back. But not yet. After you present the comparison between Henry George and Gesell. Thank you.
Well, I don't think that I'm going to have to retract on that basis because Silvio Gesell completely buys the Georgist perspective that rent on land is one of the two causes of economic dysfunction and injustice, and he adds to it rent on money, which is interest. They are both economic rents, and he would just say that the Georgist analysis and diagnosis only dealt with half of the picture.
But if they are both rent, you agree that George was more general. It's just Gesell emphasized on one subspecies of rent, but George's remedy would solve that just ab initio, because it would identify it as a rent and then basically eliminate it and eradicate it. The fact that most people don't understand the usurious rent, which I think also the term tribute that you use implies that understanding, doesn't mean that George did not give the most general understanding and of how rent and its insidious role in destroying the free market economy is. But let's wait until we have that presentation, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Because as you're surely aware, the word rent is tricky because people use it in very different senses. And the way that I believe you are using it and the way that I am using it is in the sense of what we otherwise would refer to as unearned income, some form of economic return that accrues to someone who is not providing anything in exchange for it. But that's quite different from how an ordinary person uses the word rent.
Well, I can see Jan is nodding, which means that he agrees. Thank you very much for another fantastic talk tonight, Josh. And thank you all for your very stimulating questions and contributions. And we hope to meet again for session 5 next week. Thank you and good night.